So there we go. I'll wait for the recording to get going here. Okay, so welcome everybody. We're coming to you live, I guess, from the States. Art's in Belgium and Andrea, of course, in Italy. So we'll hopefully this will all go smoothly and we'll have a wonderful workshop today here with you all. Talking about DSpace 7, of course, 7.0. Just to give you a sense of what we're going to be going through today, we split the workshop in half here to give everybody a little bit of a break in the middle because 3 hours is a very long time. And I know I don't really want to be in front of Zoom for a full 3 hours, and I doubt any of you do either, no matter how interesting the topic is. But I'm going to start you off here for the first hour or so. These numbers are relatively rough, so we'll see how long it takes to go through the basics of DSpace 7, installation upgrade, configuration, and the sort of plan beyond 7.0. We will have a little bit of a virtual coffee tea break, approximately 15 minutes, but as I said, we'll kind of play it by ear, see how our schedule is going at that point in time. And then we'll have Andrea talk to you a little bit about the REST API, give you an overview of the work that's gone into that. And Art will go through some examples of user interface branding and kind of walk through how that can be done and some of the basic things you could do at that user interface level. We will have a live Q&A at the end if we have time, but we also, oh, actually, I forgot I had this slide in here first, but I'll get to the Q&A part in just a moment. There is other topics, other presentations on DSpace 7 at this conference this week, just to make you aware. So there are places you can dive a little bit deeper here. I'll be talking a little bit tomorrow around how we got to DSpace 7.0 and some of the complications that arose with trying to develop such a massive overhaul of DSpace. Andrea and his team will be talking a little bit more about the enhanced submission workflow on Thursday, and some from the Atmire team, including Levin and Ben, will be talking about the configurable entities a little bit more. I will touch on each of these as we go through this morning, or well, this morning for me, it might be afternoon for you or evening. But I'm not going to dig deep in each of these topics necessarily. You'll get a good overview, but there will be some more information coming up in later talks as well. As far as Q&A goes, we do have the Q&A available within Zoom. However, for our purposes, we would absolutely love it if you could utilize this link. And if Art or Andrea could copy this into the chat for everybody really quick. This is a Google Doc where we're trying to capture all the questions, both from this workshop as well as for other DSpace 7 talks that'll be coming up. And the purpose here for capturing them in a Google Doc is not only do we get a good sense of the questions that folks are asking, but it also gives us a place that we can refer to later on to kind of improve this workshop, because we do want to rerun this workshop in other locations and other ways. We also want to be able to make sure all of your questions get answered. So we're going to do our best here throughout this talk to answer all the questions that come up within that Google Doc. However, if we run out of time or there's something we just can't quite get to, what we'll do is Art, Andrea, and myself will go back to this doc and we'll answer the questions within that document, send those answers out to the entire list of attendees, just so you have those to refer to. But this Google Doc will remain live for the entire conference period, so all week long. You'll be able to add questions into it, modify things into, or modify your questions or tweak things there, ask follow-up questions if you need to. There is also an area there for feedback. If you have feedback for us, I know there'll be a way to gather that through open repositories as well, but we'd love to get some feedback on how this workshop goes, what things you'd like to hear more about, and that sort of stuff. So that's the Google Doc there. And let's go ahead and move along into the actual, oh, I lost my keyboard here. Okay, so the main question you're going to have first is, when is 7.0 coming out? So as you know, it's not out today. However, we do have a date for you. It will be out by August 2nd of this year. So just in a little less than 2 months here. It's possible it may be out even before then, if we're really, really lucky. But we can guarantee to you today that on August 2nd, you can go and download DSpace 7.0, install it for production use, do your upgrades, do whatever you want to do. but you can start utilizing it on August 2nd. Before then, we will be obviously, I mean, the code is already available. You can already start to play with it. You can already start to test things out if you want to. What we're really working on right now is stabilizing the last few bugs that we ran into in the community testathon, as well as improving the accessibility, since we had some accessibility testing that occurred. But that's what we're kind of working on here in this little time frame before August 2nd. But you are more than welcome to start playing with it already. August 2nd, it's ready for you to download and use in production. So here's an overview of what is included in DSpace 7.0. That's what we're talking about today. We're not going to be talking too much. Well, we'll touch upon 7.1, 7.2, things like that that'll be coming up later. But today's workshop is really about what can you do now? What can you play with now? I will be going into each of these in a little more detail here, as well as giving some brief demos, not live demos, a little bit of pre-recorded demos just to make this easier to do over Zoom. But this is what you can look for here. We got, of course, the brand new user interface with a redesigned submission, my DSpace, search, admin tools. Basically, everything has had a touch of Flash added to it, a little bit of extra wow, I guess, for lack of a better word. It's going to look a little bit nicer to you, and we're really excited to show all those sort of features to you, demo some of them today. We have some enhanced user privacy features. We've brought some of the command line processes to the admin UI. They're called processes in the admin UI, so you can actually run command line tools from your administrative user interface. There is now a basic embedded video player as well. We know folks have been looking for the ability to stream video directly from DSpace. That does exist in 7.0. I imagine we'll probably be working on making that work a little bit better in 7.1 and 7.2 as we're going down the line, but it's there. It's disabled by default, but you can use it, and we'll have a demo for you here in a bit. We have a fully featured REST API, which Andrea is going to show off later on in this workshop. Support for OpenAir 4, we got configurable entities, but the big point here is that all of this is built on the same backend as DSpace 6. So we have modified the backend to improve it and enhance it to give you all these extra features, but it's still a lot of familiar tools and familiar setup in that DSpace 6 backend. So if you recall with DSpace 6 and 5, if you're using DSpace already, this will be very familiar to you. The front and back end are sort of all together, and usually you're running that in Tomcat up here, and you have a series of web applications that you are installing within Tomcat. You may be using just a couple. You may be using all 7. Well, I doubt you're using all 7 because you got 2 user interfaces there, but you may be using about 6 or 5 of these in your Tomcat. So DSpace is really in DSpace 6 and below. It's a series of web apps you can install and decide how you want to run in your Tomcat. You got your database, you got your files in the file system, in your asset store. That's sort of the DSpace that we're all used to. As we know, that's changed a little bit here in DSpace 7. So you have a similar backend, and that's what I'm going to talk through first here a little bit. So you still have Tomcat. You still have Apache Solr doing our indexing behind the scenes there. I will note though that Solr is now installed separately. It's not embedded as part of DSpace. That was a requirement based on how Apache Solr is now able to be installed these days. You can't embed it anymore. But the one big change that we've made on the back end here is we've put all these various web apps into one web application. So we have what's just called the server web app. And in that web app, by default, you basically just have that REST API, which we'll talk through, that brand new REST API, and OAI PMH enabled. But you can enable or disable the other features within that web app to allow it to speak SWORD, speak RDF if you want it. There's SWORD version 1 and 2. You can turn off the OAI PMH if you don't want that, but it's all one application now on that backend. But the same sort of database structure, same asset store back there on that backend. Obviously, the front end is totally brand new. The front end, we're running Angular on Node.js with Bootstrap. That's this little stack of cards here. And Art will be going through a little bit more examples later on in the workshop of how we can utilize Bootstrap and just our theming capabilities to do some of that basic branding of the user interface. But that's kind of the basic setup or architecture at a very high level of what DSpace 7 looks like. It is worth noting we still do have things like search engine optimization that's built into Angular via the server-side rendering that Angular has. So Angular has its own server-side component. We won't get into that deeply here, but it's just worth noting that we're still keeping all those basic functionalities that you expect out of DSpace, so you can still have full indexing within Google Scholar, and we've worked with the Google Scholar team to make sure this new user interface is fully indexable and works just as well as DSpace 6 and before, and all those sort of features that you're looking for out of DSpace. I mentioned accessibility testing already. That's another thing that I know is important to everybody, is making sure that UI is accessible. So we're still hitting all those key points out of DSpace 7 that you already came to expect out of DSpace 6. So a few more technical design goals. So the front end is themable by Bootstrap designers. So our goal on that front end is to make it use default Bootstrap styles as much as possible. So that you can hire somebody who knows Bootstrap well, knows a bit of HTML, of course, that goes along with Bootstrap, and you can theme your UI that way without having to understand all the complexities that are going on within that Angular framework. You'll need some basic overview of what's there and how things are laid out, and that's what Art will talk through later on today. But our hope here is really that Bootstrap designers can do a lot on their own without a whole lot of necessary needs to dig into Angular. We are looking towards that accessibility alignment, and this is what we're being tested against right now. The backend, as I mentioned, is one web app that makes it easier to install and configure. You're configuring it all through those CFG files, able to enable OAI PMH via just a CFG, enable a disable command. It's also less resource intensive, so you don't have those 6 or 7 web apps running, each with their own separate resources that you have to align. Instead, it's all just in that one web application that you can just spin up and run and give its appropriate resources. So that's kind of a high level overview of where DSpace 7 is at an architecture standpoint. But what I'm going to go through now here is more of what do the features look like? How are things changed in the various components that you see within DSpace itself? How are things going to look different? How are you going to use it in a production sort of scenario? And I will note that I do have the Google Doc up in a separate window here, so I am kind of keeping an eye on things there. So if you do have questions as we're going, you are more than welcome to start to add questions into there. And I can pause when I see important questions coming in. I realize obviously there's going to be a little delay as I'm talking through things and as it takes a little while for folks to type things out, but totally be willing to ask questions as we're going here, because there's a great opportunity for us to kind of clarify things if things are not making sense. But let's go ahead and dive into some of the main features that you're going to see within DSpace 7. So I've kind of separated these out by sort of concepts or components. So we'll start at the search level. So we have some new search concepts that are available to you. You're going to find that search is now available from the header everywhere. We have dynamic filters and search throughout the application. Search is also available everywhere within the application. So things that you couldn't search before are now fully searchable. You can even search within filters to find the filter value you're looking for and have date range filters and some grid thumbnail views, different ways to you'll get to your search results page. You can see the filters over there on the left, and you can actually select for down a specific set of that author's works. So I can see what that author wrote within a specific date range and jump over into a thumbnail view where if there were thumbnails here, you'd actually be able to see a more visual representation of what that author has written or done, the works they've done. So this is just repeating now here again. this is a good point here, though, to note as well that all of these slides will be available right after our workshop. So you don't need to quickly jot down any links or notes. You'll be able to go back and review all these. And that's why I also built these moving GIFs here, the recorded GIFs, in order to make sure that you can actually see the same demos after the fact. So you can share these slides and look at these demos that we had gone through of each aspect of the application. So that's the basics of search. It is worth noting that you're going to see search come up all over the place. So we have search built in all over the application. You're going to see those in several other areas of this demo. The search look and feel is the same across the board. So you're going to see a common feel of those filters over on the left. The ability to actually see the currently enabled filters under that search box, the ability to jump over to that thumbnail-based view. All of that is common throughout the application. So you're going to get very familiar with how search works here as we go. But next, I do want to note more on the admin tools, because we did a lot of enhancements here on administrative tools, specifically within the admin UI. So in this demo, you're going to see that we have the global collapsible sidebar, which is not only available for administrators, but it actually is also available for anyone with special permissions within the application. So anytime you're wanting to do something that you can do at more of a global level. So exporting metadata to a CSV or importing metadata from a CSV, or just if you're a collection admin, community admin, or a submitter, actually being able to create a new item as a submitter, create a new collection as maybe a community or collection administrator. All those tools are in this sidebar, but this is also where we have all those admin tools, and you're going to get a good sense of that in this next little demo here. It does allow you to create that content from anywhere within the application, but it's also context aware. So if you're browsing to a specific community and collection, you want to create something there, it's going to suggest creating it in that location before anywhere else, but you could change that suggestion and create something at another location. As I mentioned, we're going to get a quick view of processes here as well, where some of our command line tools are now available within the admin user interface. We will see some more search capabilities here in the admin side as well. So I got several demos here to kind of go through these and talk through some of these features from an admin level. So first, this is a basic just example of logging in as an administrator and showing that this sidebar appears with all your options. If you don't have an option, it won't appear. You can pin the sidebar to make it open all the time, or you can let it just collapse automatically. In this case, I'm searching for a community to create a new collection within, and then you can immediately just create that collection right within a community, no matter where you are in the application. If I had browsed to that community first and then go to create the collection, that community will appear first when you select that create a collection option. It'll be the first thing that comes up, so that you can immediately just create that community right in that location you've already browsed to. But this is just an example of how that creation works from wherever you are. You can be on the home page or anywhere in the application, realize you need to do something, and get it done using those admin tools on the sidebar. And I see there already are a couple questions coming in. I'm going to get into some of those here as we go. And I'm going to pause here for just a moment, because there's one that I wanted to answer first. So there's a question here about, can search filters be easily added for any metadata field in the repository? The search filters are dynamically being created based on the backend search configuration. In your discovery configuration, we can provide a little bit more details within that Google Doc and link you to some of the documentation there, but it is based on what filters are coming back from discovery. So you'd have to create a new filter at the discovery layer, but that discovery configuration is the same discovery configuration as in past versions of DSpace. So there's still discovery XML there. I am going to get to some of these others as we go. And Art and Andrea, you're welcome to also start to type some of the answers in there as you know them, or as I'm answering them. But a few of these other ones are going to be a little bit easier to answer as we go along here and present other parts of this. Okay, so this was our first admin tool. Next aspect of the admin UI here. So I'm still logged in as a full admin, and here I'm going to show how exporting metadata to a CSV works. So you can actually search for a collection, export that entire collection to a CSV, and this is actually creating a process dynamically. So this is one way of getting these processes created, and it schedules this process that's running in the backend. This was a really quick one to complete. So it's already completed. You can see the output of that process after it has been completed. You can download the CSV file that it created and open it then on your system. So some of these demos run through things relatively quickly here, but I want to give a good sense of how each of these features sort of work. So this is one example of where processes has been built into another feature, that being that export to CSV, where that already worked in DSpace 6, and now it's done in a slightly different way, where it's kicking off a scheduled process that's running immediately behind the scenes. And as soon as it completes, you're able to download that CSV and see the results. And if any errors occurred, you'd see that in that process output. So that's one way that those processes are being utilized. And another way on the admin side of things is actually viewing all your processes. So this is going to the processes area, and you can actually see a list of all these command line tools that are already enabled. So this is where you can see that the metadata import and metadata export tools are there. You can actually even re-index your site from processes. And there's a few other features here that you can run automatically from that processes area. And you can see all the past exports that have been done or past processes that have been run there by other users or by yourself, I'm sorry. But in any case, the processes, it's worth noting here that not every command line tool, as you can see, is yet built into processes. That is coming in terms of trying to build as many as possible into these processes. I can't guarantee we'll have 100% of the command line tools over there, because there may be some that just don't make as much sense to enable from the admin UI. But the goal is to be able to see better control your site across as a repository administrator, and you won't have to actually go to the command line and do all that stuff there. I'm seeing a lot of questions come in here, and I think I'm at a good place to pause. Actually, wait, there's one more admin demo that I'm going to show, and then I'm going to pause and look at a couple of these questions to see what's been coming in here and see if there's others we want to answer now, and others might be answered as we go along here. So let's move along to the last admin demo. This one is related to administrative search. So this is sort of an advanced search functionality for admins, where it's a similar admin search option, but now you can search across withdrawn and private items as well within the system, just using your administrative search, and immediately have actions that you can perform on those withdrawn or private items based on current item status. So it allows administrators a little bit more control in finding these items within their repository and searching with them alongside other items. And we plan to add some additional features in there as we go, but right now it's really about private and withdrawn items and being able to actually utilize ways to reinstate them, make them private or public, as well as the capability in there. You may have seen briefly, there's a move functionality there to allow you to move items from one collection to another. So it's a way that you can do all those administrative tasks more quickly within that administrative search functionality.
Sorry, Tim, could you please slow down a bit, sir? Because some people are writing in the chat that it's a bit hard to follow because you speak too fast.
I'm speaking too fast? Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Sure. Yeah, there's just a lot of content to get through, but thank you for noting that. So I'm going to pause here for a moment anyways and see if we can look at some of the look at some of the questions here. And there's a lot of questions coming in here, so I'm trying to see if there's any that we can pull out here that are easily answerable in this particular demo. I'm going to go ahead and yes, some of the so there's okay. So is there an advanced search? Is one of the questions that came in here. The advanced search, I'm presuming, is that you may be referring to is the one where you can actually do Boolean searches in the in DSpace 6. And the answer looks like one of my colleagues already typed that in. So no, it follows the same approach with DSpace 6 with Google-like search that can be refined progressively by applying filters, so narrowing things down. So that is very much like that that first demo of search concepts. So you can add in multiple terms, and I believe there's some basic sort of Boolean support where if you add like an and in there, it knows that you're trying to combine those together. But it's really more about a Google-like search experience with filters, with being able to filter things down, remove those filters, and kind of get your results down to a set that's more appropriate for what you're looking for. And there's some stuff about migrations. I'm going to answer some of that later because we're going to talk about migrations and upgrades. We talked about search filters a little bit. There's a little bit about performance degradation after Hibernate. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on in the upgrade and migration as well. So there's questions about the author authority file here. Does DSpace 7 bring an author's authority file so we can control various forms of an author's name and relate them? My version of DSpace at the moment is 5.5. So someone's already started to answer this as well. So the authority framework that existed in DSpace 6 or DSpace 5 still is available within DSpace 7. So you can use that just as you did in DSpace 7. The new feature that we'll also be talking about here in a bit is with DSpace 7, you can also utilize configurable entities to manage authors and manage different forms of an author's name. So that's also a way to do it. So there's a couple ways that you can manage authorship. We'll get into that a little bit more here as we go. And we're going to get through some of these other questions. I think we're going to answer here as we go later on. There is a question down here though about admin tools. Can admin tools be configured which features to show? So where an admin tool is configurable already within the DSpace CFG file or any of those other CFG files, there are some tools that you can actually enable or disable there. If you can disable them there, that's where the UI would obey that sort of thing. But a lot of those tools are more dynamically based on your permissions. So they appear based on whether you have the rights to do that thing. So when you're logged in as an admin, you'll see that full admin bar. And let me go back to that admin demo screen. You'll see every single option here with all these capabilities enabled. If I was logged in just as a community admin, I may only see being able to create a new collection, new item. I could create a new community under the community I owned, but I wouldn't see things like the admin search. I wouldn't be able to manage access controls or manage the registries. So it really depends on your permission level. That whole menu is dynamic based on what permissions you have been given. And in some ways, those permissions are configurable in the backend. So there are capabilities that have been built into DSpace 5 and 6 where you can manage permissions from for community admins and for collection admins. And decide what they can do. And those permissions then would be respected by that admin side menu as well. But there is, if there's more features folks want there in terms of being able to manage that more, that's good feedback as well. As you start to play with DSpace 7, let us know how these admin menu features look. If there are things you'd like to be able to enable, disable, that's good feedback, and we could start to look at doing so in later releases of 7.x. So I'm going to move along here a little bit to get through a couple more demos, as it looks like some folks are already talking about some of the upgrade questions and things like that, which I'll get into a little bit more here later. Let's move along to get back where we were. So we talked about processes, being able to start processes dynamically, as well as seeing what processes have
It's like we lost Tim. Looks like we lost you, Tim. I don't know, maybe you can stop your video.
Let me try and stop my video here. Can you hear me, Irina?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, unfortunately, the one day of the year my internet decides to act up on me.
I think we lost you for a couple of minutes, maybe a minute. So if you could repeat what you were saying, like last couple of sentences. Sorry about that. I guess Tim will rejoin the session. Lost you again, Tim.
Yeah, I apologize. I don't know what's going on my end. Like I said, this is like, go
That
ahead.
happens. That happens.
Yeah.
Don't no worries.
Yeah, it's like the one day of the year that my internet is unstable. Usually it's fully great, but let's try this again with my video off. I'm gonna get my screen shared again here. Just a second. Trying to get everything set back up. Okay. Let's try this again. Okay, so let's try it this way. Yeah, let's try it this way and see if Andrea is having better luck. Thank you very much, Andrea. And I can give you a hint, or at least let you know when I want to move on here to the next slide. I can see you in the slides though. Okay, so let's start through here again. So submission concepts here. So we have the one-page form, collapsible sections. I'm not sure how much of this you heard before, but I'm going to get into the demo here because I want to show off these more in the demo. So we have, because especially the auto-filling by uploading various files, and the fact that your submissions are now searchable, so you can find what you were working on a little bit easier than before. So let's move on to the first demo screen here. So first is just a basic example of a submission of dragging and dropping a file into a collection. So you get to select your collection, drop the file in, and then start off your submission from any drag and drop upload. So this is just sort of a traditional fill everything out yourself and make sure, get all your fields entered, but you'll see there's different sections along the way here. And there's some fields that appear side by side in terms of multiple fields per row. So there are a couple different capabilities here that you're kind of probably already noticing in the submission process. The fact that the sections all have little identifiers in the upper right as well to let you know whether or not they're completed. And I know this video is moving a little quick. It looks like it moves quicker over Zoom than expected. But you can see all once the sections are filled out, you can deposit that file and it appears within your My DSpace area. So that's just sort of a very basic drag and drop submission. So if we want to move along to the next example here. And so next up here is an example where we're uploading a PubMed XML document in that drag and drop submission. And because it's a PubMed document, something that is already recognized by our system, it automatically extracts the metadata out of that PubMed XML. And it allows you to then just drag over whatever files are associated with that particular publication and have a much quicker submission process. So that works with not only PubMed files, but as I listed in the previous or a couple slides before, BibTeX files, RAS, archive files, and EndNote files. And other formats may be accepted later on, but I believe those are the main 5 or 6 there that we currently support. But the idea here is to make the submission a little bit easier on folks, to allow you to be able to auto-complete a lot of this information if you already have it in another system, as long as your system can export one of these files or a set of these files, drag them over, and it auto-completes for you, making your work a lot easier. So if we want to move along to the next demo here. This is an example of the My DSpace area. So you can see all of your items that you've previously deposited, and you can filter based on what's in your workspace, and actually go back to exactly what you were last working on. As you may have glanced there briefly as well, that My DSpace area has all those same search functionality that is available elsewhere. So you can filter, you can search within it to find exactly what you were working on, or maybe something you had previously deposited that you just want to jump to quickly. All that is available in your My DSpace area to allow you to kind of quickly get back to what you were doing or what you're looking for. So those are the basics in the submission area as well. Next, we're going to go through workflow concepts, and I am going to go ahead and just keep moving along here for a little bit since we were unstable. We're a little behind time here, but let's go ahead and go through some of these other demonstrations here. So from the workflow side of things, we support configurable workflow out of the box. And you'll see areas to quickly claim here as this demonstration is showing, and allow you to quickly review things. So you can approve it, reject it, jump into editing that item, or return it back to the pool as needed. Again, you can see you can search through all of these workflow tasks in the same way that you can search everywhere else. In this example, we're rejecting an item though and sending that back to the submitter. But it's got a lot of those same functionality here. So again, this is from the My DSpace area, and it combines both your workflow tasks and your search tasks in the same way that it has been done in the past, but it's much easier to browse through and search through to find exactly what you're working on. And a little bit easier here on the workflow side to just be able to quickly approve or reject things if you know right off the bat that it's something you can pass through or need to push back. So that's the basic example on the workflow side. We also have another demonstration here on administering workflows. So this is in the admin UI area. You can actually go through now and be able to do some basic administrative tasks on all the workflows that exist in the system right now. So every workflow is listed to administrators and allows them a couple basic options. Right now, you can either kill the workflow entirely, delete the workflow, and delete the item if you know that item has already been submitted elsewhere and you just don't need it anymore. Or you can kick the workflow back to the submitter to have it restart, or have the submitter restart it if they need to. We are looking at some other options. There's some other options that have come up in terms of being able to add additional administrative workflow features, but those are the basic 2 that exist currently in DSpace 7. This is just another way that administrators can better control the workflow process and have a way to restart workflows. If something has got installed or someone's gone on vacation, they can go ahead and have a way to restart them from that administrative area. So let's move along to the next section here. So I also wanted to show off a quick demonstration of the enhanced privacy capabilities within DSpace 7. So we now have a user agreement. You have user preferences for cookies and tracking. There's a privacy statement within your site, and that's customizable along with the user agreement. And you can also delete any account within the system quite easily. So there's a quick demonstration of this, which we'll walk through here briefly. And so this is a brand new user coming to the site and being able to manage their cookies. You can also customize your cookies after the fact if you want to change what information is being tracked. Well, cookies and information that's tracking you. So Google Scholar and things, or not Google Scholar, Google Analytics or things of that nature. And when you first log in as a user, you'll also see an end user agreement, which again is totally customizable based on your site. Every user must accept that user agreement before they can actually interact with the system or utilize the system. And all that information is available by default down in the footer. So you can go back and manage your cookie settings again from there. You can go back and look at the user agreement. And there's also a privacy policy, which is linked from that cookie section, as well as down in that footer area. And so those are the basics of that, the enhanced privacy features in DSpace 7. And so we're going to pause here for a moment. I know there's been a lot of questions coming through here. And it looks like some folks are saying that Google Docs is blocked for editing because there's too many users. Apologies for that. Let's go ahead and see what questions have come through. So there's some questions on using the REST API. We'll have basics on that in today's workshop, but there will be some more advanced workshops coming. And I'll admit that today's workshop is really just giving you a taste of what is in DSpace 7 and allowing you to understand what all features are there and coming down the line. There will be some more advanced workshops around development, around interacting with the REST API in much more advanced ways that will also be coming. And let's see here. And I'm looking to see if there's other questions that have been coming up. There is some questions about is DSpace 7 completely in agreement with European GDPR? The GDPR features that we've added so far, we are working towards as much compliance towards GDPR as we can provide out of the box. Some of those are dependent on your local policies, but I will note that we had a GDPR working group built mostly of Europeans that went through all these policies and set up all the features and policies that are necessary to be in DSpace 7 out of the box and align them towards European GDPR rules and regulations. So we are, like I said here, we are not lawyers. You need to definitely do some analysis of this yourself, but our goal here is to make this GDPR compliant as much as we can do so out of the box, and make sure that your policies also align, obviously, with GDPR to allow for that full compliance on your end. So that really is the goal here. If we find any issues with that compliance so far, those would be considered bugs, and we would work on resolving them as quickly as possible within the next DSpace 7 release. Lots of questions here. I'm not going to be able to answer all of these. Let's go ahead and move through some more of these slides just to give us a little bit more time to answer things at the end, because there's a lot being typed in at the dynamically. And if Andrea or Art notice questions you want me to call out, definitely bold them here, because it's hard for me to scan through all of these rapidly and read them all in a live manner. But it looks like some of these have already gotten some answers in the Google Doc, and we'll make sure that the Google Doc is shared broadly after the fact, even if you can't all unfortunately get into it quite yet. Okay. Let's go ahead and go forward here. So installing DSpace 7. So I'm going to go through some of the basics here of the installation process. I want to note that these are simplifications of the install process, and the full installation is on the wiki at that link at the bottom there. But I do want to go through the basics of this so you understand what's in front of you in terms of installing DSpace 7. So if we can go forward here on this slide. Okay, so first off, There is a quick install option. If you just want to install things quickly and easily and try things out, I would recommend going with a sort of quick install via Docker. This is what our developers use heavily. You are welcome to look at our Docker scripts and adapt them for production, but I will note that we have not done production level testing on our Docker scripts, but these are used heavily by the development team, especially myself, in testing pull requests, making sure things are running and working. And you are more than welcome to use these to quickly spin up the front end and back end. And there's also some test data that comes along with it that's all documented here. But it's literally like a couple line, couple Docker compose commands, wait for a couple minutes, and the UI is available to you, and the REST API is also available. So this is what I'd recommend first if you want to go ahead and just get a very quick installation there for development only. But going into the full installation here, the backend, as you saw in the diagrams, is quite similar to the past backend. So it's a lot of similar tools here. You're going to see Java, Maven, Ant, Tomcat. You need a database back there, either Postgres or Oracle. The new thing here is that Solr has to be installed alongside those. Luckily, Solr is not difficult to install on most operating systems. It's a pretty quick script, and it might be something that's easily available via like an apt command in Linux or things of that nature. So this is the basic prerequisites you need in place on that backend. They're very similar to what you've seen before. In terms of installing it, the installation is quite similar as well. You're going to download the code. There's a local CFG file, which if you're using DSpace 6, you're already familiar with this. This is where we recommend putting all your configurations. So you want to configure at least the basics there, where you want it installed at, the DSpace directory. Build it with Maven and Ant, build and deploy with Maven and Ant. Deploy that single web app into your Tomcat. And then there are some Solr config directories that you just copy over into the Solr installation. And this will ensure that the Solr installation knows about the DSpace indexes that we're using so that DSpace can interact with your Solr and make sure everything gets indexed there properly. So that's really the basics of installing that backend. The front end side, you have two main dependencies here. You're just getting Node and Yarn. This can be installed on the same system or on a separate system from the backend. And it's totally up to you how you want to install this. For smaller sites, I'd recommend you may just want to do it all on one server if that's easiest for you to do so. But you can totally have separate servers or separate Docker instances or cloud services or whatever you want to do to make this happen. So the Angular front end here, you would download the user interface, run some yarn commands here. I'll run a yarn install to install all of our dependencies. There's a environment file that you got to do some very basic configuration within in order to build it. Again, that's all documented within that installation on the wiki. And then there's a couple options here. For production, you're really going to go through this 5 and 6 together, where you're going to first build the front end. And then you're going to either run this serve SSR or deploy it via a service like PM2. And PM2 is something that just keeps your application running in a more stable fashion, and you can monitor it a little bit easier than just using the yarn commands. But if you're just running it quickly and want to try something out quick, there's a yarn start command that does both those in combination, that is more of a bit of a quick start that allows you to just kind of get it up and running and try things out. But for production, we have it documented more like this, and you're really probably going to want to install PM2, which is just a node module. It's very easy to install with a one-line command. But let's move along to the next slide here. In a production scenario, you may want to have something like Apache in front of these two. This is really sort of up to you, but I'd recommend looking at this approach because I find it to be quite simple and seamless, just because Apache has a lot of great ways to monitor it and great tools for monitoring logs and dealing with it in lots of modules, and very familiar to most everybody. But one way to possibly approach this would be to have Apache managing your HTTPS, your secure connection there, and then it's passing things off to either Tomcat or PM2 based on whether they're accessing the user interface or the REST API. But this is only one approach. You can have the Tomcat and the PM2 on totally separate servers. You can even have them under separate URLs. So right here, I have them under a subpath example under mydspace.edu, but you could have one being api.mydspace.edu for your REST API and just mydspace.edu for the UI. It really is kind of, there's a lot of ways you can mix and match these, but this is one very basic example that we document within our installation process that you might want to take a look at as you're getting familiar with DSpace 7. So let's move along from there. It is worth noting, this is something that some folks have run into while they were testing our early betas. We really stress security on the back end. And so the backend is built with security protection in mind. That REST API backend has a lot more security protection than DSpace ever had before. So it does require that you run HTTPS. You have to run an HTTPS if you're doing production. The only way to run it in HTTP is if you're running everything on the same server in a development environment. So that's one thing to stress. It also has protection for things like CSRF. It has CORS headers, and it only will trust what you configure as your user interface by default. It's not going to trust any other client unless you tell it to trust it. And what that means is that other clients can read basic information from it. They can get information that's public information, not access restricted, but they won't be able to log in. So login is only trusted by trusted clients. And so some folks have run into that. Some of these sections do need to match up. So your backend, the server settings there should match your front end's REST settings. And on the back end, you also need to make sure the UI is configured properly. But let's go ahead and move on here. I already saw some questions about upgrading. So this is going to go through the upgrade a little bit, somewhat at a higher level, but we can get into a couple more of the questions here as well. The first question they often hear is there an upgrade path from all these old versions to DSpace 7? And the answer is yes. So we are still doing the same sort of upgrade path from any old version of DSpace to DSpace 7.0. Your data can be upgraded automatically using our normal database migrate script. So there's a database migrate script that behind the scenes is using some database tooling to automatically update your database to the latest version, move around tables if it needs to, get everything ready to go there for you, as well as make sure, and the files are still in the same sort of places they've always been. So your data is going to upgrade automatically. You may want to, however, if you're running on an older version, start with some fresh configurations in your local CFG file. That file was introduced in DSpace 6. So if you've already done this and upgraded to DSpace 6, then you can pretty much skip this and just go forward with your installation of DSpace 7 there. But if you're not yet upgraded to DSpace 6, you really should look more closely at that local CFG and perhaps reconfigure some things in there because a lot of configurations changed in DSpace 6, and there have been some that have been added and modified a little bit in DSpace 7, but there was a lot that changed in DSpace 6 to be aware of. So let's go ahead and move forward. That backend upgrade process, that automated upgrade from any of these old versions is very similar to the past. So if you upgraded from 4 to 5 or 5 to 6, or even 3 to 4, a lot of those are quite similar to what you're seeing here. So you just need to make sure you're upgraded to the latest prerequisites. Again, having Solar installed as that new thing. And then let's move forward. It's a similar process of downloading that backend, making sure you got that config file in place, running the Maven package, and then doing an ant update. For DSpace 7, you do have to run this manual, well, it's not manual, it's still an automated database upgrade, but you have to run this command from the command line because it's doing a couple extra steps to your database to ensure things like our configurable workflow system is fully enabled within your database. So you have to run this database migrate ignored command to upgrade your old database to the new version. And there are some configs that have changed a little bit. So a good example of this is the submission configuration area. The old input forms.xml has now moved to a submission forms.xml. We do have a script though available that will help you with this migration. If you want to just run the script, it will change your old file into a new files format and you can go with that. You can also just look at that new format. It's very similar in structure to the old file format, and you can reconfigure your submission as needed if you want to do it that way. And then similar to the install, deploy to Tomcat, copy your Solr configs over to Solr to make sure Solr knows about your indexes. This is the one gotcha that I do have to note, of course, is that despite the fact that you can upgrade from any old version of DSpace, there is no way to upgrade your old user interface. That's just not possible. So the old XML UI and the JSP UI, those are gone for good. And you cannot upgrade anything from them to the new DSpace 7 user interface. So in your upgrade process, this is the one point which is more of a migration than an upgrade, is that everyone is going to have to migrate to the new user interface. So install that new user interface and then customize or brand it how you see fit using HTML, CSS, and Bootstrap. And like I said, we'll go through some examples of that today. So let's move along here. Let me pause very briefly. So let's see here. We're going to go through some configurations. Some of these I may have to go through a little bit more quickly because we are running slightly behind time. But the slides will be here for your reference. But let me pause briefly to check on our questions coming in. I see the Google link was reposted. Paulo asks, can it be considered to have Tomcat embedded with the DSpace deployment? Paulo, that is something we could consider for a later version of DSpace 7. So what you're kind of talking about is having Tomcat automatically embedded within DSpace, and that is possible because the DSpace backend now is on Spring Boot. So it uses Spring Boot, which has the capability to embed Tomcat within it, so that you can kind of just click on the application and then Tomcat spins up and it would run DSpace automatically from there. So yes, that would be possible, but it is currently not enabled within DSpace 7.0. So that's the clarification point, and I admit I have not tried it in DSpace 7.0. So I don't know if it will work out of the box in that way, but it is something that I think we could strive towards making DSpace 7 even easier, is just taking out that Tomcat piece. So that's a good question there. I know there was also a question on the upgrade process regarding performance in DSpace 6. And I did want to kind of note to that. So someone had noted there are mentions of performance degradation after Hibernate and introduction in DSpace 6. And would this still be an issue in DSpace 7? So far, we have not noticed those same issues in DSpace 7. The main reason for that is because the DSpace 7 backend acts a lot in a very different way than in DSpace 6 used to act. So the DSpace 6 front ends, the user interfaces were built for, I don't know how to say this best, they were built for an older version of Java, an older way of doing things. And in some ways, Hibernate did conflict with that a little bit at times. So there were ways that performance degradation could occur. It didn't occur for everybody, but there were some specific scenarios where it caused issues in DSpace 6. The difference in DSpace 7, though, is the backend user interface does things like pagination by default for everything. The backend of DSpace 7 does pagination by default for every request. And there's some caching built in on the front end as well. So we have not hit any of those same performance degradations because the pagination on the back end protects against some of that performance issues where you could throw too many requests at Hibernate at once. The pagination allows us to more easily control that behavior a little bit. So I can't give you 100% certainty that we've fixed every single issue of that, but I'm pretty certain, I would say 90% or more, that a lot of those performance issues will be gone in DSpace 7, but try it for yourself as well and report back. I'm checking to see if there's anything else here that's upgradable about upgrades or installs. Not seeing anything else right now that I want to call out. Some of these we'll have to answer after the fact. Yeah, not seeing anything else right now that I'm going to call out. So let's go ahead and move forward. We may be able to have some extra time here at the end. So we're going to go through the configuration side of things. I'm going to go through some examples of new configurations. I'm concentrating more on the newer side of things, assuming that you're coming with a little bit of knowledge, but obviously DSpace 6 configurations, the underlying backend configuration system in DSpace 6 is the same in DSpace 7. So if you need more information about what came into DSpace 6, I'd recommend going back and looking there as well. But starting from the user interface side of things, there's one main environment configuration file here, your environment.prod for production. And this allows you to configure a couple things that you might want to be aware of. So this is the first example of the language selector in the user interface, where you can configure which languages are available in that selector. And so by default, there's a good 10 or so languages available. You can leave all of them available if you want to make sure that any are selectable by your users. But if for some reason you wanted to simplify this, it is very possible to go into those language selector settings and change one or more of them to be inactive. Inactive just means it won't appear in the dropdown, but your users, if their browser still recommends that particular language, they will still see the site in that language if the site is translated in that language. And that's a good point as well to note that I think we only have about 10 or so languages there so far. If you're interested in helping us translate into more languages, we would love to have that support. We're trying to make this as translated as possible, like in past releases. So here's another example, the browse by options in the all of DSpace. These are all configurable as well. There's 4 by default. You can disable one by just taking them out of that types area if you don't want to have that browse by feature. You can also add more. However, doing so requires some configuration on the back end. I didn't go into that in this example, but essentially if you add a new browse by option on the back end in your discovery configuration, it'll appear from that API discover browses endpoint under a specific ID, and then you can enable it in the UI using these browse by settings. So this is another thing that you can configure at the UI level. And here's that basic media viewer or video viewer. It is disabled by default, but you can just turn it on by setting it to true. It also does have some basic image pagination functionality as well, where you can page through images sort of at a full screen level. So that's also within that basic media viewer. But I'd recommend giving that a try, seeing how that works for you, and letting us know what your feedback is. But this at least gives some basic streaming capabilities within DSpace videos. And so on the back end, I'm going to go through, again, some of the newer configurations. The backend configuration directory is very similar, though, to past releases. And all of these configurations you can pull in, well, not all of them, but a good portion can come into your DSpace CF or your local CFG file from the DSpace CFG. So these are the important ones that you'll want to have in your local CFG. Most of these should be familiar for the most part, other than you have new URLs here. So you have the server URL, which is your backend's URL. You have the UI URL, which is that default trusted client. And it's where you need to configure your user interface in order for logins to work from there. And that's the only client that backend will trust by default. But as you can see down at the bottom, there's this REST CORS allowed origin setting that allows you to add additional trusted clients. And there's documentation into how to do so in the configuration docs there. But that allows you to be able to configure more. So on the submission side, we have 2 configuration files still. So we still have that same item submission.xml. The input forms XML has been renamed to be submission forms XML. And the renaming was somewhat purposeful because the structure of that XML has changed slightly. Not significantly, though. It'll look quite familiar to those who have configured these submission forms in the past. Let's move along here. The item submission XML is that main configuration that lets you define the steps that are available in your submission. So a step tag now represents a section within that form, and you can decide whether that section is mandatory or optional, whether they actually have to fill something out there or not. A step section also has a type. Most of your step sections will have a type that they are a submission form, in which case they're configured in that submission form.xml file, which we'll see in a second. But there are a couple special types. There's a step that allows for upload for that drag and drop. There's also a step that allows for licensing. So like the license that you need to sign off on when you're depositing, your deposit license, those sort of steps. So let's move forward from here. Here's a very basic example where you can see a submission process named traditional. This is that default out of the box traditional submission process, has 5 steps defined, and those correspond to those 5 sections. You will notice there's a special step at the beginning though that is a collection step. And that is that collection drop down at the top. It allows you the ability to change what collection you're submitting into in case you selected the wrong one at the beginning. The other steps you can reorder as you see fit, have them in whatever order you want. You can remove them or reconfigure them. And those first two, those 2 describe steps are submission forms. So those are ones where you can decide what fields are going to be configured within those specific describe forms. Let's go ahead and move forward. And those fields are what get configured in a submission forms.xml file. So this is that replacement for an input forms.xml. And it defines the metadata fields that appear within the submission. You can have fields required or optional. You can also define now rows of fields. So you can have 2 fields appear in one row if you want to put them side by side. And a new feature here, you can also define metadata on specific files. So when you're uploading a file, you can actually have metadata files that you want people to use to describe those bit streams, those files. So we'll see a quick example of that as well. So this is what that structure looks like. Again, you still have those field tags that allow you to define what metadata fields are there, whether you can add more than one, whether they're required. You'll see a row tag there where you can add multiple fields per row if you want to, but that's totally configurable in the same way it was in DSpace 6 and below. Let's go ahead and move forward. This is a quick example of the multiple fields per row. Out of the box, the date of issue is set next to the publisher, and those are just 2 fields in one row. And here's a quick example of the metadata fields for bit streams. So when you upload a file, you can actually click a little edit button next to that file. So it allows you to change the title, the actual file name. By default, it gives you a description field as well that you can describe that file if you want, but you can customize these in a specific form called bitstream metadata. So you can add extra fields there that you can either require or make optional in the same way that you can in other areas of the form. So we'll go briefly over the workflow approval system configuration. So let's move forward here. Again, I had mentioned this previously, but it's worth stressing, DSpace 7 only uses the configurable workflow. So this workflow configuration has been available for a very long time within the DSpace 7 XML UI, but it is new to some of you, and some of you may not have ever enabled it because DSpace had a separate traditional workflow setup. But this configurable workflow allows you more control over how your workflow approval process works. And by default, it still uses that same 3-step process. So you're going to review things, then you'll have an option to edit and review it, and then the final step is edit only. But it is totally configurable how you want to structure that in a workflow.xml file. The one note here, though, is that in DSpace 7, one thing new is that the structure of this workflow XML file has changed so that things are defined as Spring Beans. They used to just be a generic format we sort of made up. There's a migration script as well available for that, for migrating to that new structure. So let's move along. This is the basic example of what that looks like. So you see beans here that define a workflow of 3 steps, and they all refer to separate beans. So this is defining that basic 3-step workflow process that you normally see in DSpace. So you have a review step, an edit step, and then a final edit step. And each of those steps, the review step, edit, and final edit, are defined also in that same workflow XML file. I haven't given the full example here, but this is all documented and has been documented in that configurable workflow area of the DSpace 7 docs, and even in DSpace 6 and before. There's a lot more information though on submission and workflow in Andrea and Giuseppe and Claudio's presentation on Thursday. So I'd recommend attending that if you want to get some more detail about any of that configuration and more examples. So I'm going to give a quick overview here of configurable entities as well. There is a presentation on this too, so I'm going to maybe gloss over a couple of these things relatively quickly since we're running short on time. But the basic concept here, if you haven't heard yet, configurable entities is a new concept in DSpace where an entity is defined as, it's always an item. It's always got a specific type or sort of a label, a type of an item. And those items, those typed items can have relationship to other entities. So entities can be related through relationships. Entities, though, are 100% optional, and in fact, they're not enabled by default. So if you want to use them, you can use them. But the default behavior of DSpace is the same as it's always been with just normal community collections and items. But let's go through. So entities in DSpace 7 have two main structures that are defined out of the box, but they're 100% configurable. You can add entities of your own type with your own relationships, but these are just a couple sorts of relationships that we felt were important and models that were important to DSpace, to the DSpace community that we've heard come up many times in the past around DSpace should support this sort of feature. So one of these models is related to journal hierarchy, where we have an entity called a journal that can be related to an entity called a volume, related to an issue, and an issue can be made up of various publications or articles. So those are all entities that are out of the box, and they have a relationship of that structure. So journals can contain many volumes, volumes can contain many issues, and issues can contain many publications within them. Another structure that we also provide out of the box is a very simple form of author profiles or a research system where we use that same publication entity, but now we can relate it to people, the authors of that specific publication. And those people can be parts of projects, and those projects or people can be parts of an organization. And those parts of the organization can be embedded within themselves. So an org unit can be a department that is also within a college, and that college is part of the university. You can define each of those as a unit of your organization, and you can define the projects and the people within those units, and you can then link them up to their articles. So keep in mind, all of these are items. So it's sort of a weird concept at first when you think about it. So if there's an actual person item in the system, whereas we tend to think of items as relating to documents or PDFs or Word documents or videos or audio, but now items can represent a person and have an author profile page. They can represent a project and have a project profile page. They can represent an actual unit of your organization. And all of those can be linked together through these entities. Let's go ahead and move forward. This is just a basic example video that goes through the journal hierarchy structure of being able to search for a specific journal, and you can limit by that item type or entity type to go to the journal page where it's linked to its volumes. You can also search within that journal. So all those relationships are searchable. You can browse down through the volumes and the issues to see what articles are in a very specific issue of that journal. That's just a very basic example of that journal hierarchy. Let's move along to the next one. Then we have, next we have an example of a person. So I'm searching for a person and going and limiting by an item type of person to be able to see the person profile page. Again, you can search within everything that's linked to them, all the other entities linked to them, their publications. You can also jump directly to a publication and you can see it's linked back to the author themselves as well. So there's a two-way linkage here between all these entities. And that's what's described here within this configuration model. This is a very basic example of a journal issue linked to a publication, and that you could define both a leftward link and a rightward link. So is publication of and is journal issue of, and define how many exist in each. So let's move along here a little bit. So you have those generic types. Those are the entities. You can define a journal issue entity and a publication entity. You have the leftward and rightward names. Those are the links. Go ahead and keep going. And then you can define the cardinality is the next part of it here, which is allows you to limit that a publication can only be in one journal if you want, or you can only have a minimum of 0 and just have no limit whatsoever to the linkages. But this allows you to have more control over those entities. So everything gets configurable within that relationship types XML file right now. And in order to create the entities, you actually have to import that file into your DSpace using a command line tool. New entities that are listed in there are just created within your database structure. And all the linkages or relationships between them are created in your database structure. If they're old entities, they're just updated based on the updates that you put in that XML. But that XML is not used as a live configuration file. Right now, it's just for helping you load this information into the database, because the database is where these entities are actually configured. So we do plan on building more tools around making this even easier, adding more configurability onto entities, but this is how it works in DSpace 7.0. Let's move forward here. And again, remember, entities are all items, so you can use all the same features that items have for entities. So a lot of entities have their own custom metadata schema. So there's a person schema out of the box for a person entity. They can have their own submission form, so you can have a person submission form, and there is one actually out of the box available for you to use if you want to use it. So you can have person entities that are created different from regular publications. And they can also appear differently. You saw that already in the demo and the user interface, that different sorts of user interface display occur based on the entity type. And each of these schemas, while they are out of the box, the schemas and the configurations are out of the box, they're disabled and not used by default. So if you want to use them, they're there for you as sort of templates, but you don't have to use them. So entities also support a concept called virtual metadata, where we're trying to avoid duplicating the storage of metadata. So you're wanting to be able to read metadata sort of across those relationships. And it's better to show examples here, but the basic concept is this virtual metadata concept can be used anywhere metadata is used in DSpace. So it comes out of the REST API as if it's real metadata. It also appears in OAI PMH as if it's real metadata, but it's actually virtual metadata that is created based on a relationship. So there's an example at the bottom, but I walk through it here in the next few slides. So virtual metadata gets defined in a virtual metadata.xml file. So this is configurable as well, but we configure some basic virtual metadata that you may want for your entities. So this is an example of where a virtual metadata field is using dc_contributor.author at the bottom there to define something called a publication author author. That's the reference there. And you're going to create that dc_contributor.author field anytime you have a relationship named is author of publication, which is what that beginning thing is. So this is a way that that relationship creates a metadata field dynamically. And that metadata field gets populated based on the other side of that relationship. So from that person object, if that person object has a family name field and a given name field, it gets put into that dc_contributor.author field. And also if they have an organization legal name field, that can get put there as well. So what you end up seeing in the user interface is you can see regular metadata alongside and even intermixed with this virtual metadata. So on an entity, you may see some authors come back as plain text where they're not linked or hyperlinked, whereas other authors might be hyperlinked, which implies that they are an entity and you can click on them to jump right to their profile page. So that allows us to intermix that virtual metadata alongside that regular metadata. And again, it's totally configurable. That's all I'm really going to go through on entities. It's a very high level look though. And there's a lot more of a deep dive with Levin and Ben on Thursday in that same DSpace 7 session. So this I want to get into before we take a brief break. What's next for DSpace 7.x? So 7.0 has a lot of features, as you saw, but it's not everything there. So let's jump in here. We'll go through the roadmap for 7.x. What we're looking at here is that we have some 6.x features have not been built into 7.0 yet. And there our plan for the coming year, essentially, approximately, is several different 7.x releases. over the span of however long it takes us to get them done, but we're hoping that it'll be as quickly as possible in the same way that we had this beta release process. Over the last year, we released 5 betas in 1 year, and we want to do a very similar thing with the remaining 6.x features. So we're going to do several different smaller 7.x releases, so 7.1, 7.2, 7.3, 7.4, over this next period of time, releasing as quickly as possible these prioritized features. It is worth noting that prioritized features link there does go off to a wiki page, which you can look at after the fact, where our DSpace governance group has prioritized the outstanding features for 6.x based on the feedback from their institutions, and oftentimes the feedback from their from many different institutions, because some of them represent many institutions at once. And so those prioritized features are the ones we're going to walk through in each of these releases, starting with a 7.1 release. We are still planning exactly what that 7.1 will look like and when it will be out, but those plans will be announced a little bit after that 7.0 release get out the door. It is worth noting as well, we'll have some new features interlaid within that and new upgrades and bug fixes along. So we obviously want you to give DSpace 7 a try. The demo sites are always available for you to try. The Docker installation instructions as well are down in that try out DSpace 7 link, and I already kind of linked you to that beforehand. And this gets us though to our virtual coffee break here, but I'm going to pause for a second to see with questions where we sit. You can go to the next slide if you want, Andrea. There's just a virtual coffee break slide. So we're linked to our Q&A here. Okay, so we've got about 5 minutes to where, so Andrea and Art, I'm going to pause here for a moment. Do you two feel comfortable doing a 10-minute break here? Knowing that it seems like my connection was the whole problem. Looking for a quick answer from the two of you.
Yes, I think we can.
Okay.
Yeah, better to have a quick snack break.
Yeah. And I'm looking here to see if there's any other questions that I can answer briefly. Actually, let's do this. Let's have a 10-minute break here for everybody. Go refresh your coffee, get some water, get a snack, whatever you need to do. During that 10-minute break, I'm going to take a look at these questions and see if there's any that I can pull out to answer very, very briefly before I hand things over to Andrea and Art to lead you through the REST API and the Angular UI. But let's give 10 minutes. So that would put us at, I don't know what the UTC time is right now. Where are we at here? Let's see. Let me go back to my agenda here. That would put us at, let's put it at 35 after. So, or 25 till the next hour, based on your hour here for everybody. So it's about a 9-minute break as of now. We'll be back at that point in time to start things back up. So thank you all. And then that, and be back. Yeah, thank you. Go ahead and write that in there, Andrea, thanks. Oh, no, 35, not 45, please. Really quick, are you back? Okay. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started again here after the break. I do want to, before I hand things over to Andrea to get his slides going, I was reviewing some of the questions here. I see there's a lot of questions around entities. So I wanted to answer maybe 1 or 2 briefly, and then also note that we do have that separate entities presentation by Levin and Ben of Atmire, where they'll have a deeper dive into entities. But there were some questions around how entities behave with OAI PMH and whether entities need to be in collections. And the answer is they are items. So as items, they still need to be in a collection. And since they're items, they also will appear in OAI PMH as if they were items. And that's where things like virtual metadata come in handy, because they will automatically have additional metadata based on their relationship. So you'll see that metadata appear as if it was an item in OAI PMH. That said, because they're in collections, you can group them in OAI-PMH if you want them to be ignored. So if you're not interested in the entities being there, you can kind of group them into specific collections so they appear in certain sets and ignore those specific sets. So that's a quick answer there. And I also saw a good general question here around whether that entities seem like it's a step in the direction towards integration of CRIS inside DSpace, and whether that's something we're going towards. And I did want to just note that that has been a discussion within the DSpace governance, and that we have been talking for quite a while now with the Force Science team, Andrea and his team, around finding ways to make CRIS more easily accessible out of the box within DSpace. As you all may know, there's the separate DSpace CRIS project with which Force Science provides for everybody, and it's still open source and built on DSpace, but it's supported separately and all that. And we are trying to find a way to integrate the two together and make a more out of the box, seamless experience that you can decide to turn on or off as you see fit. So I'm going to leave it at that. There's tons of questions, great questions in here, and I'll get to answering some of them in the Google Doc, but I'm going to hand things on over to Andrea to let him get started.
Thanks, Tim. So he's Andrea from Force Science, and we will have more or less 20 minutes together to go more in depth over the new REST API. So the question that I'm trying to answer in the next minutes is why we need a new REST API for DSpace. Most of you probably know that DSpace already have introduced the REST API in version 4. And we start with our read-only REST API, but over the time, new feature was added and also some limited write capability was added to REST API. But unfortunately, the REST API of previous version of DSpace was untrafen in Jersey. That is a successful technology, but is not what is most used in the DSpace code base. And the feature also with the introduction of the write operation was not doesn't cover the whole feature of DSpace. So for the new version, we face with the challenge to implement all the feature in the REST API. And this is a must-have because the Angular user interface need to talk with backend using the REST API. So everything that you can actually do over the user interface need to work over the REST API. Angular only talk with your backend via the REST API. This is also the better guarantee that the REST API are always full, well documented, and work properly in all the use case. And automatically, this will give you a much better third-party integration capability for your DSpace. Everything that you can do, again, can be done just because some REST API exists. But we also want to take this opportunity to make the job for developer easier, the life of developer easier. And we decide to implement a new REST API using the most adopted technology into the DSpace ecosystem, that is Spring. So the new REST API are rebuilt using Spring Boot, Model View Control, and Spring Atios library. This is also to support the idea to have a very well-documented REST contract, REST API, and to follow standard and best practice. I see in the chat that there are some trouble with my audio.
I'm hearing you fine, Andrea, but I have a headset on, so I don't know if others are.
Maybe
Art,
just...
can you hear Andrea?
Yeah, I can also hear Andrea well.
Okay.
If there is an echo, because I don't hear any echo.
I
That's
don't hear an
strange.
echo either. Okay, others are saying the audio is okay. So I'd say go forward.
Proceed. Unfortunately, it's some local issue. So I really like this picture from Martin Fowler that is represent Richardson maturity model that probably you know. The idea is that when we talk about a REST API, there are different level of quality of the REST API that can be implemented. We want to be clear. Our goal is to implement a really modern and efficient REST API. So we are saying much more than just using HTTP as protocol to have Angular to talk with the backend. We want to use the right wording for things on the backend side. We want to use the full capacity of the HTTP verbs and hypermedia control to drive our REST API. So which standard will be more important in our REST API? Two over other. The first one is hypertext as text engine of application state. This means that our REST API give hint to the client about what comes next. When you make a call to our REST API, you are able to, reading the response, figure out what next operation you can do. So if you get a list, you can get a link to get the tail of a specific element or thing like that. And to enable this capacity, this capability, we have decided to adopt a HAL format. This is a specific format that can be implemented both in JSON and XML. We stick to JSON for the DSpace 7 REST API, and we'll define a specific syntax that is used to highlight such link. So other important REST terminology and decision that we make for the DSpace REST API. First of all, our REST API is stateless. This is really, really important because this will give us the opportunity to have to scale the application vertically or horizontally very easily. There is no session on the backend, absolutely no session on the backend. Each request that go from the Angular side, from the front end to the backend, have no memory of previous request. This is really important, but also pose some challenge, especially in regard to the authentication. And in this regard, we've decided to adopt JSON Web Token, JWT specification to manage authentication on the client side. As we anticipated that we want to make a good REST API, it's important to note that our documentation, our REST contract, will talk about resources and collections. So we refer to the collection term when we talk about collection, aggregation of resources. And a single resource is just something that can be addressed with an URI. So a single endpoint of our REST API. We use the HTTP method in the proper way, so that when we read information, for instance, we use the get method. When we want to change some data, we use the post or patch method as appropriate, and of course also delete and other methods. Also, we take care also to be very uniform and consistent in managing HTTP return codes. All of this effort help developer to easily understand our REST API. You can expect a consistent behavior of our REST API. And also using the verbs and the return code in a standard way also make much easier for the developer to interact with our REST API, because developer framework for Java or any other language will play well with our REST API. So just a bit more information about the HAL format that we have adapted for our response. So we just provide an answer in JSON, in plain JSON object. But our the HAL format describe each resource in with 3 sections. There is some resource state that is just the plain old JSON property related to your object, such as the metadata of your item. There are links that from the current resource allow you to make the next action. So you will see that we use the links to follow navigation so that you can move from one page to the next page when you get search result, for instance. And the third section of the HAL document is the embedding one. This part is really important, and we will see that will allow us to have the best performance for each use cases, allowing the backend to include detail about the linked entity directly in the original request. So, how you can interact with our REST API? There are several ways to do that, and this is just the easier one. Of course, you can play with it using the command line. You can use wget or curl or any command line tool that you like to just query our REST API endpoint. But in our web application, we also have embedded another open source project that is named the HAL browser. That is a small, a lightweight JSON application, JavaScript application that allow you to interact with our API automatically. This HAL browser is built up automatically, just looking to the REST API, understanding our REST API thanks to Hatia's principle and the HAL format. And we will touch base also with the use of Postman. That is a very common tool for developer, and we provide a Postman configuration for DSpace so that you can easily play with the REST API using Postman. So how the HAL browser look like? If you go to the root endpoint of your backend, you will be presented with this JavaScript web application. You see that there are several sections in this web application, and you start from the first section where you can just input the endpoint that you want to query, and you can manipulate the query string. You can add some custom header that are really important when you interact with REST API. And when you trigger a request, you will get the response directly into browser. You will see the status code, all the header that are returned, and also the response body in the form of JSON object. But how browser do a bit more. As he understands the structure of our HAL document, he will extract automatically the links section, the embedded section, and the property section for you, so that these are rendered in specific section. For instance, when I hit the root endpoint of our REST API, we get in the HAL browser the property that will not, which is the DSpace user interface endpoint, which is the name of our demo in this case, which is the endpoint for our REST API, the running version of DSpace, and so on. But we also get the links. So from the root endpoint of our REST API, we can start to explore our REST API. We can hit other different endpoints. This is what I before say that our response include the next step. So inform our client what can be done next. So one important fact about the slash API endpoint is then this entry point will list all the endpoint available in our REST API. So it provides itself the documentation of our REST API. And you see here again all the links so that you can explore using get method, or maybe making a different request, such as a post or patch over a specific endpoint. One important thing, and you also make question about that, is for performance. We have made a strong decision in the design of the REST API, and by design, all the endpoints need to be paginated. So when you hit any resource collection, so imagine the list of items in your repository, the list of collection, the list of community, and so on, you always get a page of information. So you will get the first 10 entry, 20 entry, or something like that. And pagination, to move from one page to the next one, is done in a consistent way that is described in our REST contract. So that, for instance, here you see a request to the communities endpoint, where you see that we return 48 elements, but we just give you a window of 20 communities in the first response. And we say that we have 3 pages of response. And in the links section, you have standard named links to move to the first page of result, to the next page of result, to the last result, and also to access a search endpoint across your collection, so that you can make a more sophisticated search and filter around the REST API resources. Performance is really important. We put a lot of effort in set up a backend that can really provide the best performance, the most suitable answer to different use case for the REST client. One of the key features that allow us to do that is named projection. So the client, the REST client, is allowed to decide which information are relevant for him. Imagine that you want to just make a query over items, and you already know that you want to show the time mail of the item in your result list. So it's not enough for you to only get information about the items, but you also need to get information about the time mail bitstream attached to this item, or maybe the only collection of this item, because you want to show this information in your result. In a basic approach, you will be required to make several REST API calls. You will ask for the items, and once that you get an item, you will ask for the owning collection, the logo, and so on. But using projection, you can immediately say, oh, I'm interested to get information about the link identity, specific link identity, or the graph of all the linked object up to a specific tab. This is exactly what the projection parameter allows you to do in the REST API. And you can implement on the backend side custom projection that allow you to really tailor your REST API to your specific use case. One important thing about projection is also that they respect security. So you don't need to worry about the fact that using projection, people will be able to see more information than they are authorized for. In this example, you see how a REST endpoint have returned several community, and the property of this community are present and has embedded resources directly in the HAL browser. embedding again work for all kind of links. So you can ask to embed collection when you are retrieving community or sub-communities or logo, as in this slide, for instance. Our REST API also support authentication, of course, because many operations that you want to perform over DSpace are only available for authenticated user. So you can log in also into your browser using any supported authentication method of DSpace. DSpace 7 implements the same authentication method than the previous version. So you can use Shibboleth for your login, or you can use the local username, password, or LDAP, or other authentication methods supported by DSpace. When you log in, you get a JWT token that need to be passed to all the subsequent REST requests as an header in your HTTP request. So what is more in depth a JWT token? Is a special string base 64 encoded that is signed by the server. So just looking to this string, the server is able to guess if this string was modified by the client or altered in any way. So the server can really trust this string without the need to make any additional query onto the database or any other additional check. If you look to the structure of this string, you will see that there are essentially three sections. The first one is to inform the server about which is the cryptography algorithm that is used to encode the word string. The second portion contains the payload data that the server have released to the client, and it can be reused by the server, just can be trusted by the server. So in the case of DSpace, we include the user UID and the special groups of the user in the payload. This means that the server, if he wants, he can just trust what is written in this token without check again for security group, special group of the user. And all of that trust is established by the verified signature. So the last part need to be verified just using a secret that is only known by the server. So if you attempt to modify any data in the payload section, the verification will not work, and the server will know that you have tampered to data. But again, security is really important for us, and to support some authentication providers, such as Shibboleth, for instance, we still need to temporarily send authentication detail over a cookie. This is just in a short period of time. Is a temporary cookie that is just used to complete the Shibboleth authentication. But also in this case, we are literally open to cross-site request forgery attack. And to defend against that, we have implemented the recommended OSWAG technique of double submit cookie protection. So this means that if you look to requests that need to be done on the REST API, especially for change requests, so anything that is different than a GET request, you need to include an XSRF header that will be verified against a secure cookie that is sent automatically by your browser. Finally, we are also decided to implement a specific standard to deal with change on our REST API. And this is the JSON patch specification. So to make change to an existing object, you need to perform a JSON patch request. What is this? So It's a simple protocol that allows you to express the change that you want to make in a list of subsequent requests that need to be performed in an atomic transaction. So if you send 10 operations, all these 10 operations need to succeed, otherwise all of them will be rolled back. And there is a standard syntax to explain how you want to alter a JSON structure, removing some data, adding additional data, or replace data, or move content across your JSON object. A concrete example, look into our space item where we have a section named traditional page one that contain a title and an author metadata. If we want to add an additional author, what we need to do is to send a patch request saying, I want to perform an add operation over to JSON path traditional page one / DC contributor author, and means to me that I want to append this new information to the end of my JSON document. And the new value is just a JSON object that have a textual value for the metadata with another comma author name. So the result of this operation will be a JSON like that for our workspace item. So I say we also provide Postman configuration to explore our REST API. You are really invited to check out this additional project that is the REST tutorial from DSpace Labs. And please open pull request to add more exercise, more endpoint to our default configuration of Postman. What you will get when you import this configuration in your Postman is an automatic creation of a Postman collection. I will have a bigger image here, where you get inside a folder structure all the API endpoint that have been configured. So you have a endpoint for authentication, to manipulate the registry, to content management, submission, and so on. And all the endpoints are organized by category again. One important thing in the Postman is that you can easily check which endpoint are you going to hit. You can modify the verb that is used, providing query parameter, additional header to interact with the REST API.
Yeah, looks like now we're having issues with Andrea's sound. Sorry about that. Yeah, maybe Zoom can't manage long sessions.
Yeah, this is an exciting discovery. Okay, let's see here. Trying to find Andrea's slides where he let off, but he'll probably join us again here shortly. And I think he was in his wrap-up standpoint in terms of talking through Postman, which I know, Art, you linked in the Postman configs already. And so the last thing, yeah, here I'll see if I can bring this up since I know we're running short on time here.
So if it doesn't work, perhaps Art could start his part, because Andrea was indeed wrapping up already.
I could do that.
Now, let me share my screen really quick, and then I'll do a very quick wrap up here. Art, and hopefully you don't lose me. If you lose me, feel free to to go forward. But the last thing that Andrea was going to go through here was the fact that we have a REST contract here, which is in GitHub. We're managing our contract, which is where what all the endpoints are and how they interact with one another and how to use all those various endpoints. And this is key for folks who are looking to do third-party integrations. You'd want to start to get familiar with our contract. The goal here, as he noted, is that this aims to be the source of truth for all of our endpoints. We are confident that it's not 100% perfect yet, but we are working towards getting it better and better. So as people have questions on the REST contract, you're welcome to ask them through GitHub issues there, and we can enhance the contract and improve it as you're learning how to use that contract. And this was the last thing you'd notice, working towards inline documentation in the REST API via ALPS support, which is in progress here, where you could actually click on the documentation and be able to see the documentation within the REST API. But this is not yet here, which is why that REST contract is important. And that was it for the end of that. And Andrea, sorry I took over for you. I see you've rejoined us.
Oh, it's perfect. It's not our day. There is a
It is
strong,
not.
there is a strong storm here, and everything got down. But
Okay, well, we'll
turn off heart now.
it is Art's chance to hopefully go much more smoothly. Good luck, Art.
Let's hope so. Perhaps to prevent that happening, I should just preventively turn off my video as soon as the screen share starts, which I'm trying to find the button. Here we go. You see my screen? Just background, zoom?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. So can I turn off video here? All right. So now you should see a browser, just DSpace 7, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
So how to brand the DSpace 7 UI? I intend to give a little bit of an overview of how you can customize DSpace 7 to your institution's needs, to put a logo, to change the news, to change the color scheme, and how you do that with the new dynamic themes feature that we added that will allow you to also have separate themes for separate collections and communities like you used to have in DSpace 6. So very briefly, what is Angular and how does it work? Angular is a framework for building dynamic applications on the browser. It basically runs JavaScript in the browser. The data comes from the backend as JSON, and the HTML is generated client side. But we also have support. So this slide explains how that works normally. So you have a server on the backend. You do requests. The code runs in the client, and it requests its data from the REST endpoint. But we also have built-in support for server-side rendering. So you could the initial request is actually an HTML page that is completely rendered. And if you don't have JavaScript, you can just keep requesting HTML pages, and everything that's publicly available should be usable that way. We've done that specifically to support search engine optimization. Lots of search engines aren't all that keen on indexing JavaScript applications, and they can work fine with plain HTML. So everything is visible as plain HTML. That should be indexed. So let's talk about how an Angular app is structured. Everything in Angular that you see is a component, and a component is basically just a custom HTML tag that we make. They come with their own code and their own styling. So a little overview here of an item page. You have the app, that's the entire thing. That's a new tag that we added, DS app. Then you have the header component, DS header, breadcrumbs component, the item page itself underneath the breadcrumbs, and then every part on it, the thumbnails, the metadata, everything is a component, and you can nest them and you can combine them and do what you want. Each component consists of a TypeScript file that contains the code, an HTML file that contains the structure, the markup, and an SCSS file that contains the style. And this is an example of how that would look in code. So you have your class in TypeScript, that's your header component. It has a selector DS header, so that's that tag. And it refers to a file that contains a style, and it refers to an HTML file. And I'll quickly show you in the browser I have set up that is indeed what's happening. So you have the DS app here. That's just an HTML tag that can be used by any browser. Then you have some themes, and well, we don't need to go through all of them exactly, but it's just all these custom components are just shown in your browser as HTML. So the DSpace UI is built using Bootstrap. Tim talked about that before. So a framework with a lot of utilities and components for building websites. And Bootstrap makes use of Sass. That's a CSS preprocessor. And it has the ability to nest CSS rules, have variables and functions. Bootstrap uses these variables and functions to configure almost everything about its components. Its color, the way they look, the way they're spaced, everything. But the downside is Sass variables can only be resolved at build time. You can't change their value on the fly. And with the dynamic themes, we have to do that, because if you go from one collection to the other, you have to be able to change the color scheme and do all sorts of things that need to be changed on the fly. So we can't use Sass variables for that. That's why we use native CSS variables. They can be changed on the fly. And they were nude. So the reason why Bootstrap didn't use them is just because native CSS variables aren't viable, haven't been viable for more than like 3 years before they had widespread support. So that's the reason Bootstrap still uses Sass, and they're slowly switching to CSS as well. In each new version, they add more CSS variables, and I expect them to switch entirely in the future. For now, we just map all Bootstrap Sass variables to native CSS ones. So you can just use either Sass or the CSS version intermediate. So here you can see the next to each other. The Sass version would be primary, then the CSS version would be BS primary. Same with success, spacer, link color, etc. So both still work everywhere in a DSpace theme, but Sass variables don't update if you switch themes at runtime. So that's only really important if you have multiple themes for your DSpace installation. If not, you can stick to Sass. Of course, we do ask if you contribute something back that you use CSS variables, because we need to maintain that support. The dynamic themes have a template theme to start from. That's a custom folder in the themes folder, and that basically contains a boilerplate code for every themable component. It doesn't change the look of anything. It just contains links back to the original HTML and CSS files. It's just there for convenience, so you don't have to start generating a bunch of files. If you just want to change something, you can just take the file that's already there and quickly modify it. Everything in the base theme is plain Bootstrap with a few tweaks for accessibility. So that's the way a template component would look. So you have the selector and the style URL. So we have a commented out version of the file in the directory with the component, but then you have the in use version is the actual component CSS file in the main app. So that would mean that this component does absolutely nothing. It just says, go get the original style, go get the original template URL if you use this theme, but you can quickly swap the two and use your own version. So there's also a DSpace theme folder, and that contains the theme you see when you go to the demo site right now, and when you install DSpace by default, it will be enabled. It started the same way from that custom folder. It changes some colors and some fonts, the news and the header. If you prefer to start your theme from it, you can, but we try to stick as close to possible to plain Bootstrap with the base theme. So you have a blank canvas to start from. The DSpace theme makes a few choices, and it may be easier to start from the blank canvas if your theme differs greatly from it. So let's start by creating a new team. No, actually, I cheated. I had one I prepared earlier because, as you see, the final step is to restart the server. And even though that's quick in dev mode, it takes about a minute. I didn't want us to be waiting for that time. So what you need to do to create a new team, you copy the custom folder, you edit the Angular JSON file to add the style to the lists, and you configure the team to be used in the configuration, and then you restart the server. So let's see how that's done. So we have copied the folder. So I literally copied this custom folder and created this OR workshop folder. I also added a few assets in there already to be used later. Then we go to see the Angular JSON file, and there we look for the custom folder. So we have an example. So here you have a styles array that contains a custom style file with the custom theme. All I did was duplicate that and just replace custom with OR workshop to have a new theme. And then finally, in the environment file, you have a themes array with a bunch of examples. I'll get it, makes it a bit bigger. A bunch of examples of ways you can configure themes. So here you have a commented out version that says, I want this theme to only be used in this handle, or I want to use a regular expression to match this theme, or I want to match an identifier. And then you have a fallback that just has no matcher, and that just says name, and then that will always be used in order of preference. So if I added another one here, then base theme would be used. So we've added a theme, and then really that looks, well, let's go to the screen here. That looks like this. So this is the plain bootstrap version. If we go to demo7.dspace.org, you can see the DSpace version of the theme. So it has a custom header, it has this blue line, it has a homepage news section that's a little more interesting, and a custom footer. And this is very plain to start from. Okay, let me have a quick look at the chat. I can't see that anymore. Okay. If there's a bunch of questions or I'm going way too fast, can someone just tell me? Tim, perhaps? No, everything okay?
I'm not seeing any questions right now, so I think the pace seems okay to me.
Okay, then I will assume it'll be all right, and I'm going on as planned. So we created a new theme. I told you it doesn't change the look of anything. So let's add a logo. I went usually I've done this twice before now, and I've used the style of the hosting university and just tweaked it a bit to their style. This time I can't do that, of course, so I considered using the Zoom logo or something, but I ended up using the Open Repositories logo and banner from their site. So we'll use those as an example to start our team from. And I've added them to the team already, to this assets images folder. So that's just inside the theme, assets, images, and that's where I put the images I want to use for my logo. So the logo resides in the header components. I can tell you this now, but if you ever want to find this out, just inspect the logo. Just look for the nearest DS tag above it. That's DS header, so you can find it in DS header components. And then you can just use your IDE to search for that DS header. There you go. Well, that tells us it's in the header components. Now I have to make sure that I'm on the right theme, because this is the custom theme. So I'm going to look now for the workflow theme, workshop theme, sorry. So the header components. As we saw on the slide, it currently does nothing. So I want to change at least the HTML. So let's switch that around, and now it will no longer use the base component, but it will use the HTML file in this directory that's plainly empty. So if it should probably have broken by now. Let's see, it's recompiling. And I really don't know what happens if you make the header empty. We're about to find out.
Live demos are for, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's taking a while. It's still doing things. There you go, no more header. It's just a navigation menu, and then no, nothing broke. Great. So in order to start from something, we can just go back to this file here. I'm gonna uncomment it briefly so I can click it to go there and just take the HTML of the existing header, go back, plug it in here, and then change the path to this logo. The path will be assets and then your team name, so that will be OR workshop. Images, and then the file is just called logo.jpg. Hopefully this goes a bit quicker this time. There you go. And there we go. I think that's all I planned to change about the header. Yes, I've mentioned all these things. Okay, so let's do a few colors. So as I said, colors are basically changes to the Bootstrap variables. So Bootstrap variables are in Sass. So we will be editing the Sass variable overrides file in our team folder. And there are already a few frequently used variables as comments. You can just uncomment, but you can see the entire list of variables by looking for this file in your nodes modules folder or just on GitHub for Bootstrap. It is really gigantic, but most of the frequently used ones are already there in comments. So let's logo again. So I have a few examples I'd like to change. So let's open that file. So the file can be found in styles and then Sass variable overrides. And let's just, let's uncomment all of this. I uncomment them all because this is a map. And if you have a variable in this map that is not defined before the map is defined, it will complain. But these are basically just the defaults from the base theme we're overriding. So it's no problem to just do that. Can I copy from here? Yes, I can. So blue, we're going to turn into this. Darker cyan is going to be lighter, I think. And it's going to be this. And we're going to change the primary color to yellow. Now you should mainly see that in things like buttons, success notifications and things like that will be yellow instead of blue. So this button, I expect to go yellow now. And these links should all turn a light blue. They have. So the links turn blue because, well, cyan, I used the light cyan as a light blue, which you can, of course. It's not because it names cyan, it actually has to be that color. You just have to see what function is that color doing and then change it. And here we say the link color is the info color, which is cyan. It's okay, but I don't like the footer. So let's touch that up next. Oh no, I have, we'll do that later, but let's do the font first. So we can just use, by default, it just uses the font from your operating system. That's Bootstrap's default. But you can just import any font you want, either locally or via Google Fonts or another CDN, and start using that. So let's do that. I chosen Source Sans Pro for this demonstration. It's a Google font that I like. And let's just add that at the top here. Yeah, the font family line here looks quite convoluted, but that's to support all different operating systems. So it's Apple system, Blinken Mac, Segway, Roboto. So that's all like for different types of phones, and then also different fallbacks. Helvetica, Arial, you have on most systems. So we want Source Sans Pro, and that should change the font. I'm running the development server, by the way. If you run yarn start dev, you get this. If you run yarn start prod, you're gonna have to wait for 20 minutes, and then you get a version that's really optimized, but not doesn't change on the fly while you're developing. So I can see the font. It looks nice. Let's prove that that's actually that font. You can see which font you're using in the browser at the bottom of the computed section here. So Source Sans Pro. What's up next? The footer, I believe. So we're going to do the same trick with the footer components. We're going to swap the template URL, the style URL, and just get the content from the base HTML file and copy it in our file. So workshop footer, get the main HTML, go back, switch these out, go to the HTML file here and paste it. And well, we lost the style now because I switched the style, but the structure should look mostly the same now. Oh yeah, and it's in white, of course, because the background is gone. But there you can see is the footer. So let's deal with that first. Footer, go to its CSS file in the same folder and say footer should have a light color and a dark background. And light and dark are just default variables provided by Bootstrap. And then you can see it looks like this. We have some margin properties problems here that we lost in translation by losing the CSS. So let's go here and let's make use of Bootstrap classes instead, because Bootstrap contains a lot of useful classes. I'm quickly, I think I have a link to the docs in here somewhere. Yes. So Bootstrap has a lot of these classes for like spacing and padding. You can say margin top 0, it's just the smallest, and 1 through 5. You can say padding in the x-axis 2, etc. You can use those for centering. You can use them for flexbox. If you use Bootstrap and if you're teaming for DSpace, you are going to use Bootstrap. I really recommend to have a good look at all the different utilities you have on the site, because there's a lot, and for most of the time you don't have to write CSS at all. So to give you an example of that, I think we want a margin right, the second one, so not very big, to space these apart. And we want this for the first two, but not for the last one because it's on the right. And that should push these apart. And indeed it has. Something we saw that a lot of people added to DSpace and that we've added to, in their teams, and that we've added to the default if you want it, is the option to have a top section to your footer. A lot of institutions use those to have links to anything, to their staff, to their news, to all things you might consider. So there's a div at the top here that's with an if this is an Angular command that says only render this div if this is true. Show top footer. So if we go back to the TypeScript and we say show top footer is true, then there should be a top section to that as well. You'd think that, wouldn't you? Am I in the right? No. Yes, I am in the right components. It is compiled. So look at my slides. Perhaps I forgot something. So background dark, we've done that. The margins, we've done that. The threaded.
You don't have any equals.
colon and equals. So colon in TypeScript is where you say your type. So this is a Boolean and that Boolean is true. Well, it gives it a red line because if I assign it to true, it's quite obvious that it's a Boolean, and then our lint styling doesn't like that. So just say equals true. And now we have it. It contains some simple lorem ipsum content. At first, you can put there whatever you want. You can have multiple columns. You can get rid of the columns, but it's there because a lot of people like a footer that way. So let's style that to be slightly different from the rest. So how are we going to do this? Let's say top footer. We're going to give the background dark we had before, and then make the bottom footer let's just make that black. There. Now perhaps some more padding to this. I always like more spacing. So let's again use one of those bootstrap classes and go to the bottom part of the footer. Where does it start? Here. It says P1. Let's make that P3, increase the padding a bit. There. I think that's all I wanted to do about the footer. Yes, we've done that. Let's have a look at the homepage news. So same procedure as before, just look for homepage news in your team folder, swap the URLs, swap the URL properties, and then you can start editing it. So in this case, I'm not going to take anything from the main version. I'm just going to get rid of it completely and put something else in its place. So it's gone. Let's have a div, if I can type it. So a div, an empty div for the class banner. And if I go to the CSS, we can assign some properties to it. So a background with a URL, and I have to check my slides. So you can just use the assets the same way too. So I'll just copy that here. And I said image, right? Background image. We're going to say background size is cover. Now, what this will do is just make sure that the image always fills the entire container. It won't rescale the image, so the aspect ratio will remain the same, but it will make sure it always covers it and it cuts off the edges that are too big. And then we'll set a min height of, I don't know what I took, 350 pixels. And what this should do now is put a div here with the banner from the OR site. And it does, but it has some issues. So to notice on that cover thing, so look at the image, it doesn't really rescale because the height doesn't change. It's only when the height changes, when you go really small. Well, I can go smaller than this without going into dev mode. Let's do that for a second. So if I were to go really small, you can see, oh no, there's no content yet. I'll show that later when we have some content. You'll see the image resize, but currently it's fixed on height, and so it scales the height and cuts off everything that goes outside of the width. But one thing I'm noticing here is this padding. I don't like this padding. The reason for that padding to be there is because every page, the main container has padding on the top and padding on the bottom. So you don't have to take that into account when you're making a page. But on the home page, if you're doing something like this, that is annoying. So what we're going to do is give this homepage component a negative padding that's equal to the padding we have, the padding we have here, to offset that. That's a trick that's used in Bootstrap all the time for its grid system, and we can use that here just the same. So let's have a look at what that's actually called. Can I show this on both at the same time a little bit? So I believe main content is the culprit for the padding. So let's look for that. So yeah, we have a div here, main content, and you can see this turns orange. That indicates that it's padding for that element. So I should have stayed here and checked what variable that's using, and that's using the variable DS content spacing. Let's copy that. So it's actually a margin, not a padding, margin top and margin bottom. So let's use that and say our margin top is going to be a calculation of -1 times that variable. And then at the bottom, we're going to put that again to have some spacing between the banner and the search box. And now it's flush with the top, and we have some spacing here. Let's put some text on it. Let's see what I did. We'll add an overlay. Well, no, let's take container as well. So the container is again a Bootstrap thing, and what that will do is we'll make some more text here. So that container will make sure that I'll show it here. This is basically the container that the edges of all the content on the page is determined by the container. And so it will scale nicely. If you go smaller, it will be just as wide as the content below, while still having a wider background. So that already looks good, but let's move that to the bottom and make sure it still works if we were to replace the image with something lighter, because the text might not be as legible as you might like on certain sections of the image. So let's have a look at my slides, see that I'm not doing things out of order. Yes, we'll move it to the bottom using the Bootstrap classes again. So we're going to give this display flex. Use the flex box CSS the box model, which allows you to do a lot more things than you used to be able to do. And one of those is just move things to the bottom of things. So in this case, we're going to say margin top is auto. So I don't care what's above it. I just want you to push it all the way to the bottom. But then I don't want it all the way on the bottom. I want a little bit of margin still. So let's give that I don't know, 4. That should push it down and leave a little bit of space at the bottom. And it didn't. Let's have another look. What did I forget? The banner should be flex in the container. Of course, I put it on the wrong elements. Because the container doesn't have a height. It's doing what I asked it, but it doesn't have a height. So the bottom is equal to the top, and that doesn't make a lot of sense. There we go. It's nice. And then let's put a little background on there so you can read it on the lighter parts of the images as well. So let's go to the CSS file for this component. Say overlay. So this again is a SAS thing where you can just, instead of saying .banner.overlay, you can just put overlay inside banner, and it will compile to the same CSS. So it'll work. And what did I say? Let's say RGB background RGBA. So 3 zeros meaning black, and then like .5 meaning 50% transparent. And then let's also give it rounded corners using the default border radius. Do we have? Yes, that's what it's called. So default bootstrap border radius for rounded corners. And there we are. Now, some padding still required. So let's give that some padding, again, using the classes here. B3 sounds about right. And there you go. This will work on any image. It will be readable, and perhaps to make it a little more clear, because this image is so dark, I'll get rid of it just quickly so you can clearly see what I did with the box. So basically, it's a semi-transparent rounded box. Oh, I forgot one more thing. There's some margin here at the bottom. Every paragraph gets margin by default. And we want to disable that because otherwise it's not symmetrical on top and bottom. Let's give this the class margin 0. There we go. So that should give you a nice overview of what you can change and how you should approach teaming DSpace for your institution. You can get the code at these URLs, which I'll now paste in the chat. Well, no, I can't. Can someone do that for me, please? Because I couldn't reach the chat earlier.
Yep, I'll take care of it.
Thank you. And that was it. So I guess, Tim, you want to take this section? Should I keep sharing my screen?
If you're willing to keep sharing your screen, that's fine. There's just a couple of slides left here. Yeah, and I just copied Art's links into the chat. One quick question, though, that came in, Art, that you might want to, I'll pass to you to answer from the UI standpoint. Just came in on the Q&A document. It says, can themes be defined per root community and make it sub-communities and collections inherit from that root community?
Yes. So if we go back to this config, so I don't have it open anymore, I don't think. So if you say, for example, I have this handle and that's a community, and then you have a different handle that's more specific, that's a collection. So everything, first example, you only have the handle and it's a community. Then everything within that community will get that theme. If you have within that community something more specific, for example, a collection or a single item page or anything that matches the regular expression, any route that matches one, that route will get it, all its children will get it, but not anything above that. Any other questions?
Nope, that's the only one that I see that was new. Okay, so going into our,
back to you.
Sure, going into our wrap up here, go ahead and progress here. The next slide here talks about how you can contribute if you're interested in helping out here. As I mentioned, we are in the planning stages for the upcoming 7.1 and various other releases after that 7.1. So we're looking at document a roadmap and send that out to everybody here as 7.0 gets released. But if you're interested in shipping in or helping out either with that roadmap or helping push a feature up that roadmap to make it happen earlier, you are more than welcome to join any of these sorts of meetings here. So we got the DSpace 7 working group, which is the actual development team meeting. So if you're a development person, want to chip in or help review new pull requests or even create new features or bump up a feature, as I said, on the priority list, you can join us every Thursday at 14 UTC. The next meeting will be after Open Repositories, not this week, but the week after. But we're there every Thursday unless there's like a holiday or anything like that. We also have the DCAT team, the Community Advisory Team, which is our repository manager interest group. They meet once a month. You can go to any of these are linked here. We'll share the slide link here in just a moment. You can go to their meetings though to give some feedback into the progress on DSpace 7. They also help organize our testathon, and they do various other discussions that help feedback into the features that are being built in DSpace. And then finally, we have the marketing interest group, which is a newer interest group that's helping us market both DSpace 7 and DSpace in general. They're also meeting a couple times a month, I believe, but you can check their wiki page there as well. And I see Irina is helping paste all these in here. But they're also a very useful group to get involved with helping us market DSpace 7, figuring out the best way to market to get other users, get other folks involved. So any of those groups are totally open to any and all volunteers. So I just want to kind of promote their effort here. So if you want to advance this, Art. And finally, or almost finally, this is the core contributors and funders for DSpace 7. So I didn't really allude to it completely in this workshop, but I'll talk about it a little bit more tomorrow. There's a separate DSpace 7 7.0 introduction talk about how a lot of this effort over the last year, the way we were able to keep things moving quickly, especially during a global pandemic and all this craziness, was through separate funding for DSpace 7. We actually did some fundraising to help us pay our development teams and keep them on track to get releases out at a regular basis. So getting out those beta releases, beta 1 through 5 over this last year, culminating in that testathon. All of that effort was through fundraising and through the efforts of Atmire, LYRASIS, and Science. So those are the three main groups that we're fundraising for and that they're doing most of the development and effort right now. But all the groups underneath here are all folks who contributed to funds to help make DSpace 7 come out more quickly. And so we will be continuing fundraising here to help get these next 7.x releases out just as quickly as we were able to do those beta releases. And so I'd encourage you to keep an open mind as we're coming around asking if anybody is willing to help contribute funds to make this development happen quicker. We would love to have others contribute here so we can get all these features out in your hands as quickly as possible. But thanks to all these institutions here that have helped out making this last year a huge success. So go ahead and advance. Last but not least here, reminder, we've got these other talks coming up. Tomorrow is the Tuesday talk that I will give a little bit more information on that 7.0 development process, the beta release process, as well as a couple more small demos from today as well. We've got the enhanced submission and workflow work on Thursday coming up, as well as configurable entities. So a deeper dive into both of those if you're interested in learning more on those. And last but not least here, a link to our workshop slides. So this is a live link. That very first link is ready to go. You can jump into our slides right now. We just didn't want everybody in there at the same time we're all in there. But that's the link to our slides. I will also cross-post that link into the public Q&A doc that you already have the link to. I realize there's currently a limit on that Q&A doc. I think only 100 people can get in it at once. I will look at that after this workshop and see if I can bump that up. But I also expect that there will not be 100 people in it at once after this workshop is done. But it is there for your resource. We're going to continue answering questions there. Not everything has been answered yet in that document, but I'll make sure that everything does get answered. And as we have an opportunity to, we'll make sure to send out these links as well to all the participants in this workshop. And a final note there are networking sessions here at Open Repositories, and there will be DSpace 7 team members available there. So if you'd like to chat with folks more one-on-one or in small groups about specific topics of interest. I'll be popping in on those where they align with my schedule here when I'm awake. And I know that the Atmire and For Science team both have their own little separate rooms or sort of like tables in that Wonder Me location. So definitely jump in there and ask more questions there. And with that, let's see, we got about 10 minutes left. Yeah, I see that Sketch has been linked in there as well. I'm looking to see if there's any other major questions that have come in. Looks like we have one more UI question since we were just on the UI, a follow-up. Art, if you wanted to answer this, that came in on the Google Doc. It says, could every community have an independent theme with an independent look and feel, including an independent header and footer?
Yes.
That was a nice and easy answer. Yes. And so, yeah, I would take a look at those configurations for theming in DSpace 7 because theming is really, it's very, very powerful. It's even more powerful in some ways than it was in DSpace 6. So I take a look at that, play around with it. Definitely let us know if you hit something there as you're playing around with it or have more questions as you go. Any final thoughts from Andrea or Art? Are there any other questions that you both saw come up here that we want to address live while we still have
another question, but something I forgot to mention, that with the custom team, I'm going to go out of presentation mode for a second.
Sure.
So you do get all everything that's themable in the application is here, and that will add a little to your build time. It doesn't get served to anyone if it isn't used, but it will add like, I don't know, 30 seconds to a minute to your build time. So I would recommend, if you've done and you've customized everything you want, just to remove the things you don't need, or otherwise just start with an empty directory and pick out the things you do need, but that gets a little more complicated because then you also have to add them to the module each time. So the easiest way is just to do what I did and don't worry about the build time if it's not a big problem for you. If you want to optimize it, throw away the components you no longer need.
Good hint there. And I just did link in the workshop slide link on the Q&A doc. So once you get on that Q&A doc, they're at the top of that document as well, because I know there's a lot of details in those workshop slides that you may want to reference later, including some of the stuff that I know got a little bit garbled at the beginning of the talk with me getting bumped off and Andrea bumped off briefly as well. But I'm glad it ended up well overall for everyone. So any final questions that anybody has that you want to type in quickly in the chat? Otherwise, I'm not seeing any other. Oh, wait, I see one last quick question about using symplectic elements. We may have to get back on that, actually. I don't know enough about symplectic elements to answer that, but we'll get through all the questions in your document. If you think of other questions as you go, as I mentioned, this document will be available throughout the conference. I will close it down though, so we don't have to keep monitoring it after Open Repositories is done, and we'll send out the final list with all the answers after the fact. And the recording and the slides will definitely be shared. The slides are already shared if you get to the Q&A doc, and I can copy it into the chat here as well. Let me make sure I send it to everybody. Okay, the workshop slides are at that workshop link.
And you see a question about, can you provide some comments on performance improvements, potential scalability of new architecture?
Yeah, so we've done quite a bit of internal performance testing within the development team to improve the performance based on both pagination and why am I forgetting the other name, Andrea? What's the other? Projection. I knew it was another P word. Yes, projection and pagination of the REST API, because a lot of the performance issues we were hitting early on were at the REST API layer. So through both of those and through streamlining how the UI is doing that, we have not seen major performance issues recently. However, we would love feedback in this way. And if folks are interested in trying to bang on it even more, we did have a community testathon just a month or so ago where we had folks banging on the system. Did not have any performance issues recorded at that point in time. But if there's anyone here who wants to play around early on, even before that August 2nd release date, you are more than welcome to download the software, try things out, spin it around, give us feedback, see if you're able to reproduce any performance issues within the 7 framework. But as of right now, we've been monitoring that, and we are unaware of any major issues at this time. Okay, and I'm not seeing any other questions, so I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up here. We're only about 4 minutes early anyways. As I said, the Google Doc will remain open. The slides are there for you to take a look at, and we'll get the Google Doc with answers filled out as soon as we're able to get them all filled out and sent them out to all the participants as well. So thank you all for your patience today as we work through some technical difficulties. And we hope it was a worthwhile workshop for you all. Again, in the Google Doc, if you have any feedback on the Google Doc, other than of course the technical difficulties, please give us some feedback on the workshop in that Google Doc, because I do plan on rerunning this workshop more times in the future here. I know LYRASIS is also looking at ways to turn this into perhaps several smaller webinars. So we are looking on feedback on the structure of the workshop and future workshops that you may like to see around DSpace 7. So feel free to enter some feedback into there as well. But that's it. Thank you all very much. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks a lot, Tim and Art. That was perfect.
And thank you, Irina.
Thanks to all to stay until the very end. And I really hope to talk with many of you at the WonderMe network session.
Thanks all.
Bye.